Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine by Jordan B. Peterson. And it's a fascinating look at some of humanity's oldest stories,
It is.
the biblical narratives, but through a lens you might not expect.
Right.
Peterson isn't just talking theology here.
Yeah.
He's going deep into the psychology and the social impact these stories have had for, well, millennia.
Yeah, and I think even if someone isn't particularly religious or even familiar with the Bible,
Right.
this book is still incredibly valuable because ultimately
Yeah.
these stories are about us, about human nature, about the challenges we face, and the ways we try to find meaning
Yeah.
in a world that can often feel chaotic.
Yeah, and Peterson does this amazing job of not shying away from the darker parts of these stories either.
He doesn't.
You know, he really gets into the complexities, the contradictions, even the violence sometimes.
Yeah.
And he argues that facing those difficult aspects is actually a crucial part of personal growth.
He does, and that's what makes the book so thought-provoking. He starts right off the bat in the introduction
Yeah.
with this idea that we're all meaning-making creatures,
Yeah.
that we have this innate drive to create order out of chaos, to find patterns and stories that help us understand our place in the universe.
Yeah, and he connects that directly to religion, right?
Yes.
He argues that religion is this, like, grand narrative
Mm-hmm.
that humanity has been creating and refining for centuries.
Right.
And within that grand narrative
Mhm.
are all these smaller stories, these archetypes, these characters that we can learn from.
Exactly, and that's where chapter 1 comes in.
Okay.
In the beginning, Peterson takes us back to the very first story in the Bible, the creation myth.
Yeah.
And he uses it to introduce this really powerful concept, the idea that every human act is in some way a sacrifice.
Okay, unpack that a little for me. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's getting at the very essence of choice. Every time we choose one path, we're inevitably giving up countless other paths we could have taken. Think about it in your own life. Choosing to pursue one career means not pursuing others.
Right.
Falling in love with one person means letting go of the potential for other relationships.
Right.
Even something as simple as choosing what to eat for breakfast involves sacrificing all the other things you could have eaten.
I had never thought about it like that. So it's
Yeah.
like this constant weighing of options and accepting that with every choice we make, something else is lost.
Precisely. And Peterson takes that concept of sacrifice and applies it to the biblical stories.
Okay.
He argues that these stories are at their core meditations on what we deem worthy of our time, our effort,
Yeah.
even our worship.
And that brings us to the Garden of Eden, right?
Yes.
That's like the quintessential biblical story.
Right.
What's Peterson's take on that?
He actually has a very interesting and sometimes controversial interpretation of the Garden of Eden.
Okay.
He focuses on this idea that we as human beings are called to subdue and dominate nature.
Okay.
And this isn't because nature is evil,
Right.
but because we have a right to flourish.
So it's not about being anti-environmentalism.
Right.
It's more about understanding our place in the natural order.
Exactly. Peterson argues that putting nature on a pedestal above human life would actually be a betrayal of our own potential.
That's a fascinating perspective, and it definitely challenges some of the more common narratives we hear today about humanity's relationship with the environment. But let's move on to chapter 2, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent of Self-Consciousness. I feel like this one is going to be juicy.
Oh, it is. This is where Peterson really starts to dive into the psychological depths of these stories. And he does something really unexpected with Adam and Eve. He doesn't see them as simply individuals. He argues that they represent archetypal masculine and feminine traits.
Okay, now that's a whole new way of looking at it. So
Yeah.
Adam embodies like order and reason, that kind of thing.
Yes. He's the embodiment of structure action, the drive to explore and build. Whereas Eve represents things like compassion, intuition, and this heightened awareness of vulnerability. But here's where it gets really interesting. Peterson says that Eve's sin, eating the forbidden fruit, actually symbolizes the emergence of self-consciousness in humanity.
Self-consciousness, that thing we all struggle with. I'm sensing a connection to the listener here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about it. Your awareness of yourself, your flaws, that's what allows you to make moral choices, to reflect on your actions. But it's also what makes you doubt yourself and maybe hold back out of fear or insecurity. Peterson's saying that tension is at the core of what makes us human.
So Eve is like the embodiment of that inner conflict, that awareness of good and evil, but also the potential for both pride and shame.
Exactly. And that tension plays out in the story through her interaction with the serpent, who represents this kind of sly, tempting voice that encourages her to question the established order.
Yeah, it makes me think about all the times I've listened to that little voice in my own head, the one that tells me to take the easy way out or to question everything.
Right. And Peterson argues that this capacity for self-consciousness, this ability to question and doubt, is both a blessing and a curse. It's what allows us to progress, to evolve, to strive for something better.
Right.
But it also opens us up to anxiety suffering and the realization of our own limitations.
Wow, that's deep. Okay, now I'm really curious to hear what he does with Cain and Abel. That's like the classic sibling rivalry story.
Oh, you're going to love this. Chapter 3, Cain and Abel, the hostile brothers, dives headfirst into this idea of competing approaches to the future and how those approaches are often tied to our deepest values.
So it's not just about two guys fighting over who gets the better offering. It's about something much bigger.
Exactly. Peterson sees Cain and Abel as representing fundamental ways of being in the world.
Okay.
Cain, the farmer, represents a more pragmatic, material-focused approach. He's all about stability tradition working within the existing systems.
Sounds a bit like playing it safe. But what about Abel? He was the shepherd.
Yes, and he represents a more intuitive, exploratory approach. He's willing to venture into the unknown, embrace risk, and challenge the status quo.
So it's like the age-old tension between security and adventure, between following the well-trodden path and forging your own way.
Precisely, and Peterson argues that this tension plays out throughout history in everything from political systems to technological advancements to artistic movements. Are we a Cain building on what's already there? Or an Abel risking it all for something new? He says this question is constantly playing out in our lives, both individually and collectively.
Now, that's an idea I can really connect with. It makes me think about those moments in my own life where I've had to choose between the safe bet and the risky but potentially more rewarding option.
And that's exactly the kind of self-reflection Peterson wants us to do. He's encouraging us to examine our own values, our motivations, and to ask ourselves, what are we sacrificing for, and is it worth the cost?
Okay, so we've covered sacrifice, self-consciousness, sibling rivalry, all within the first 3 chapters. What's next on our biblical adventure? I'm guessing the flood is coming.
You bet. Chapter 4, Noah and the Flood. Destruction and renewal takes us on a wild ride through one of the most iconic disaster stories ever told.
Yeah.
But of course, Peterson doesn't just retell the story. He digs into the deeper meaning, the psychological and social implications of this global catastrophe.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
So we left off talking about the flood, and, most people think of Noah as just this guy who builds a big boat, but Peterson sees him as so much more than that. He calls him the embodiment of wise intuition. It's like Noah had this deep, almost prophetic sense that something terrible was coming, that the world was out of balance, and he prepared for both the destruction and the renewal.
That's a really interesting take. It's like he wasn't just reacting to the situation, he was anticipating it, taking action before it was even fully apparent that action was needed.
Exactly, and that resonates so strongly with our world today, don't you think? I mean, think about all the floods we're facing, both literally and metaphorically. Climate change, economic instability, political polarization, this constant feeling that things are changing so fast we can barely keep up.
Yeah.
The question is, are we like Noah, paying attention to those warning signs? Are we building our own metaphorical arcs to weather those storms?
It's a powerful image and a challenging one, too, because it means taking responsibility, not just for our own survival, but for preserving what's valuable for future generations. Okay, so Noah builds his ark, saves humanity, and a whole lot of animals, and the world starts anew. What comes next in this epic journey through the Bible?
Well, after the flood comes the story of the Tower of Babel. In chapter 5, the Tower of Babel, God versus tyranny and pride, is where Peterson really starts to get into this idea of limits, of hubris, of the dangers of unchecked ambition.
Ah, the Tower of Babel. That's the one where humanity tries to build a tower to reach heaven, and God gets all upset and scatters everyone across the earth, creating different languages and cultures.
Yes, exactly. But Peterson's interpretation goes beyond the literal story.
Okay.
He sees the tower as a symbol of humanity's desire to transcend its limits, to reach for something beyond its grasp. It's this urge to become godlike, to control everything, to create our own reality. And as we see in the story, that kind of hubris can lead to chaos and division.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection to the modern world here. It's like everyone's shouting your own truth on social media, building their own little towers of ideology. We're more connected than ever, but understanding each other, that's the real challenge.
It's a brilliant observation. And it's not just about technology or social media. This Tower of Babel mentality can manifest in so many ways. Political extremism, scientific overreach, even in our personal lives when we let our egos run wild and believe we have all the answers.
Yeah.
Peterson is warning us that there are consequences to this kind of thinking.
So it's a cautionary tale, a reminder to stay humble, to recognize that there are forces greater than ourselves, whether you call that God or something else entirely.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that true progress often comes from collaboration, from listening to different perspectives, from recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter. We've gone from creation to the flood to the Tower of Babel. What other biblical adventures await us?
Well, now we get into some of the more individual stories in chapter 6. Abraham, God as spirited call to adventure, is all about leaving the familiar behind, venturing into the unknown, and embracing the challenges that come with that. It's like the ultimate hero's journey.
Ah, Abraham. He's the patriarch, the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? I remember the basics of his story, but I'm curious to hear Peterson's take on it.
Well, Peterson sees Abraham's journey as a metaphor for the kind of transformation that's possible when we're willing to step outside of our comfort zones. God calls Abraham to leave his homeland and travel to a new land, a land of promise. But it's not a smooth ride. He faces obstacles, temptations, and even moments of doubt.
So it's not just about physical travel, it's about inner transformation, confronting our fears and insecurities, and stepping into a new way of being.
Exactly. And it's about trusting in something bigger than ourselves, even when we don't fully understand the path ahead. And this idea of leaving the familiar behind it resonates with so many of us today. We live in a world that's constantly changing, where old certainties are crumbling, and we're being asked to adapt to embrace new ways of thinking and being.
It's like that feeling of being called to something bigger than yourself, but not knowing exactly what it is or how to get there.
Yes, and that's the beauty of Abraham's story. He doesn't have all the answers. He's just willing to take that first step to trust the call, even when it feels scary or uncertain. And that's where the real growth happens, in that space between the known and the unknown.
It's a powerful message, and it makes me think about the times in my own life when I felt that call to adventure, that urge to step outside my comfort zone and try something new. It's never easy, but it's always worth it.
And it's not just about those big life-altering decisions either. This idea of embracing the unknown can apply to everyday choices too.
Right.
It could be trying a new hobby, having a difficult conversation, or simply being open to different perspectives. It's about cultivating that sense of curiosity and courage that allows us to grow and evolve.
Okay, so Abraham's journey is about leaving the familiar and venturing into the unknown. But I have a feeling things are about to get a lot more intense because the next chapter deals with one of the most controversial stories in the Bible, the binding of Isaac.
You're right. Chapter 7, The Binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of the beloveds, where Peterson really delves into the depths of faith, obedience, and the nature of sacrifice. It's a story that has haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries, and it continues to provoke strong reactions today.
Yeah, it's a tough one. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of his faith.
Right.
I mean, how do you even begin to make sense of that?
Right.
It seems so cruel and arbitrary.
It does on the surface, but remember, Peterson is approaching these stories from a psychological perspective. He's not necessarily interested in the literal truth of the events, but in what they reveal about human nature, about our relationship with the divine, and about the choices we make when faced with the unthinkable.
Okay, so what's his take on this particular story? What's the deeper meaning behind this horrific act of sacrifice?
Well, Peterson argues that the story isn't actually about literal sacrifice.
Okay.
He sees it as a metaphorical representation of the ultimate test of faith and obedience. It's about what Abraham is willing to give up, to surrender in service to something greater than himself.
So it's about sacrificing the most precious thing he has, his own son, for the sake of a higher ideal, even if that ideal seems incomprehensible or even cruel.
Exactly, and it's about the struggle we all face between our own desires and the demands of our conscience, our sense of duty, our belief in something that transcends our individual needs.
It's a heavy concept, but I guess it makes sense when you think about the kinds of sacrifices we're often called to make in life. Not necessarily sacrificing our children, but sacrificing our time, our energy, our comfort, our dreams, sometimes even our own sense of self for the sake of something we believe in.
It's a powerful insight, and it raises a lot of questions. Is blind obedience always a virtue? What happens when our faith is tested beyond what we think we can bear? Where do we draw the line between personal responsibility and the demands of something outside ourselves?
It's a lot to chew on, and it definitely makes you think about the nature of faith and the difficult choices that sometimes come with it.
It does. And it's interesting that this story comes right after the story of Abraham leaving his homeland. It's like he's already made this huge sacrifice, leaving everything he knows behind, and now he's being asked to sacrifice even more.
It's like a test of his commitment, a way of proving that he's truly willing to follow this path, no matter the cost.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the path of faith, the path of transformation is rarely easy. There will be challenges, there will be doubts, and there will be moments where we're asked to give up things that are incredibly precious to us. But Peterson seems to be saying that it's through those difficult moments, those moments of surrender and sacrifice, that we discover our true strength and our deepest purpose.
Okay, we've talked about sacrifice, self-consciousness, hubris, and now this incredibly intense story of the binding of Isaac. Where do we go from here? Who's next in our lineup of biblical characters?
Well, after Abraham comes his grandson Jacob, and chapter 8, Jacob. The deceptive supplanter explores the archetype of the trickster, the one who uses cunning and deception to get ahead.
Jacob, he's a bit of a scoundrel, right? I remember him tricking his brother out of his birthright and all sorts of other shenanigans. Not exactly a role model, at least on the surface.
He's definitely a complex character, and you're right, he does some pretty shady things. He deceives his brother Esau, steals his birthright, and even wrestles with God himself.
Wrestles with God. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about this wrestling match.
Well, Peterson sees Jacob's story as a journey of transformation, even though he starts out on a pretty crooked path. He argues that Jacob's trickery isn't just about personal gain. It's a reflection of his deep desire for something more, for a connection with the divine, even if he doesn't quite know how to achieve it.
So it's like he's trying to manipulate his way into a relationship with God. That's an interesting take.
It is. And through his various trials and challenges, including that famous wrestling match with God, Jacob is forced to confront his own flaws, his own darkness, and ultimately to make amends for his past actions.
So it's like he's wrestling with his own conscience, his own shadow self in a way. And through that struggle, he emerges transformed.
Exactly. And he gets a new name, Israel, which means he who wrestles with God. And that's what Peterson is saying is at the heart of this story. It's about the struggle we all face to become better versions of ourselves, even when we stumble, even when we make mistakes, even when we start out on the wrong foot.
It's a message of hope, isn't it? That even those who start out as tricksters, as deceivers, can find redemption through their struggles, through their willingness to confront their own darkness.
It is, and it's a reminder that the path to transformation is rarely straightforward. There will be detours, there will be setbacks, and there will be times when we feel like we're wrestling with forces beyond our control. But Peterson seems to be saying that it's through those struggles, through that wrestling, that we ultimately discover our true selves.
Okay, so we've got sacrifice, self-consciousness, the dangers of hubris, the challenges of faith, and now this idea of transformation through struggle, all woven into these ancient biblical narratives. What's next on our deep dive?
Well, we move from the individual struggles of Abraham and Jacob to the collective experience of a nation. Chapter 9, Joseph, the beloved son, delves into the story of Joseph and his brothers, exploring themes of betrayal, forgiveness, and the complexities of family dynamics.
Joseph, he's the one with the amazing Technicolor dream coat, right?
Yeah.
And his brothers get jealous and sell him into slavery. It's like the original soap opera.
It is a dramatic story, and it's full of those twists and turns that make it so compelling. But, of course, Peterson sees more than just a good yarn in this narrative. He uses it to explore the destructive power of envy and the healing power of forgiveness.
Okay, so walk me through it. What are the key takeaways from Joseph's story?
Well, we start with Joseph, this beloved son who's favored by his father and his brothers. Consumed by jealousy, decide to get rid of him. They sell him into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt. But through a series of remarkable events, he rises to a position of power, becoming the Pharaoh's right-hand man.
It's like the ultimate underdog story. He goes from being a victim to becoming a leader, all while maintaining his integrity.
Exactly. And then in a twist of fate, his brothers end up bowing down to him, begging for help during a famine. It's the perfect opportunity for Joseph to seek revenge, to punish them for their betrayal. But here's where the story takes a really powerful turn. Instead of getting even, Joseph forgives his brothers.
So it's not just a story of betrayal and redemption. It's also a story about the transformative power of forgiveness.
Precisely. And Peterson emphasizes that This forgiveness isn't about weakness or sentimentality, it's about understanding. It's about recognizing that his brother's actions were driven by fear and insecurity. It's about choosing to break the cycle of vengeance and to embrace compassion and empathy.
It's a powerful message and one that's so relevant to our own lives. I mean,
Yeah.
who hasn't experienced betrayal or hurt in some form? And it's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of resentment and anger.
It is. But Peterson is reminding us that forgiveness, while incredibly difficult, is ultimately the path to healing, both for the individual and for the community. It's about recognizing that we're all flawed, that we all make mistakes, and that holding on to anger only poisons us in the end.
It's a lesson that's worth repeating again and again. Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter. What's next on our biblical journey?
Well, we move from the complexities of family dynamics to the establishment of a nation. Chapter 10, Moses. The lawgiver explores the story of Moses and the Exodus, the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt.
Oh, this is a big one. Moses parting the Red Sea. The Ten Commandments is one of the most epic stories ever told.
It is, and it's full of symbolism and meaning. Peterson sees it as a profound meditation on the nature of law, social responsibility, and the relationship between the individual and the collective.
So it's not just about a bunch of rules.
Right. Peterson argues that the law, as embodied in the Ten Commandments, isn't just a set of arbitrary restrictions. It's a framework for a just and harmonious society. It's about setting boundaries, establishing order, and protecting the vulnerable.
So it's like he's saying that true freedom actually requires structure, that without laws and guidelines, we descend into chaos.
Exactly, and he points to the Israelites' journey through the wilderness as a prime example. Freed from slavery, they're initially ecstatic, but soon they start to grumble and complain, longing for the security and familiarity of their former lives, even though those lives were filled with suffering.
It's kind of like the human condition, isn't it? We crave freedom, but we also fear the unknown. We long for structure and security, even if it means sacrificing some of our autonomy.
It's a fascinating paradox, and Peterson suggests that this tension between freedom and responsibility is something we're constantly navigating, both individually and as a society.
That's so true. We want the freedom to make our own choices, but we also need rules and boundaries to prevent chaos and protect the common good.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. And the story of Moses also highlights the importance of leadership. Having someone who can articulate a vision for the future and guide people through difficult times, someone who can inspire and motivate, but also hold people accountable to a higher standard.
It makes you wonder, who are the Moseses of our time? Who's leading us through the wilderness of uncertainty and challenge that we're facing right now?
That's a question worth pondering, and it's a question that leads us into the next chapter. Chapter 11, the Promised Land, the ideal and the real. Because after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, the Israelites finally reached the land they've been striving for. But as we'll see, it's not quite the paradise they imagined.
Ooh, I sense a reality check coming. It's like that saying, the journey is the destination. The real challenge often begins once we achieve our goal.
You're exactly right. The Promised Land represents the ideal, the vision of a perfect world. But as the Israelites discover, even in the Promised Land, there are still conflicts, challenges, and temptations.
So it's not about arriving at some utopian endpoint. It's about the ongoing struggle, the wrestling with our own limitations, the constant striving for something better, even when we know perfection is unattainable.
Beautifully said. And that's a theme that will continue as we move into the next part of our deep dive into We Who Wrestle with God.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into We Who Wrestle with God. Last time we talked about the Israelites entering the Promised Land, only to realize it wasn't exactly the utopia they'd hoped for.
It really makes you think, no matter how good things get, there's always another challenge just waiting around the corner.
Always. That leads us perfectly into chapter 12, Judges, the imperfect leaders. This chapter examines a period in Israelite history where they were governed by, judges. These were charismatic figures who rose up during times of crisis.
So not exactly a stable and unified form of government.
Yeah, not exactly.
Yeah.
Peterson uses this period to explore the complexities of leadership, the dangers of anarchy, but also tyranny.
Yeah.
The judges were often flawed individuals, prone to making mistakes, and sometimes even succumbing to corruption.
It's like that old saying, power corrupts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Peterson argues that even with good intentions, anyone can be tempted by power.
And absolute power without any accountability. Well, it often leads to abuse. He sees the judges as kind of representing that struggle to balance individual freedom with the need for some kind of social order, a theme that we see throughout human history.
It does make you think about, the leaders of our own time, the challenges they face, and the temptations that they have to try and resist.
Absolutely. And as we move into chapter 13, Kings, the rise and fall of monarchy, we see a transition. The Israelites transition to a more centralized form of government. They demand a king, somebody to unite them, someone to lead them to glory.
It's like they're trading one set of challenges for another, right?
Exactly. Monarchy offers stability, unity,
Right.
but it also carries the risk of tyranny.
Of course, yeah.
And Peterson explores this tension through the stories of Saul, David, and Solomon, each king representing different aspects of leadership. Saul's the first king, right? But things don't go so well for him.
Right, yeah. He ends up kind of losing it, doesn't he?
He does. He's a tragic figure, Saul. He starts off strong, but he gets consumed by jealousy, paranoia. Ultimately, he falls from grace.
Yeah.
He represents the dangers of insecurity, the inability to handle the burdens of leadership.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it?
Yeah.
About the corrupting influence of power. We see it play out time and again throughout history.
Right, and then we have David, shepherd boy who becomes this legendary warrior king.
Right.
He's often seen as that ideal ruler, wise, compassionate, courageous. But even David has his flaws. He commits adultery and murder, showing us that even the best of us are capable of great sin.
It's like Peterson is reminding us that no one is perfect.
And finally, we have Solomon, David's son, known for his wisdom, the building of that great temple in Jerusalem. But Solomon, too, he gets corrupted by his wealth, his many wives, leading the kingdom astray.
So it's like this cycle of rise and fall, a reminder that even the most successful leaders can succumb to temptation.
Exactly. Peterson argues that this pattern reflects a fundamental truth about human nature. We're constantly striving for power, security,
Yeah.
but those very desires can lead to our downfall. It's this eternal wrestling match between, our higher and lower selves.
It really makes you stop and think. All these stories, thousands of years old,
Yeah.
and yet they still speak to us today.
They do. And as we move into chapter 14, Prophets, the voice of conscience, we encounter a new type of leader, the prophets. These were individuals who spoke truth to power, challenging the status quo and calling people back to a higher moral order.
So they're like the conscience of the nation, reminding people of their values and their obligations to something greater than themselves.
Exactly. Think Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, each facing persecution and hardship for daring to speak out against corruption and injustice. And Peterson argues that these prophets, they represent that inner voice within each of us, that voice that calls us to a higher purpose, even when it's difficult, even when it's unpopular.
So he's saying we all have a prophetic role to play in our own lives, in our communities. We have that responsibility to speak out against injustice, to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
Yes, and it's a powerful reminder that real change, it often starts with individuals who are willing to challenge the status quo, to speak truth to power, and inspire others to do the same. We've covered so much ground: creation to the flood, the rise and fall of kings, that prophetic call to justice. And now we come to the ultimate challenge, the end of the world.
Yeah, no pressure.
Chapter 15, the end of days. Apocalypse and renewal takes us into the realm of the book of Revelation, all its symbolism and apocalyptic imagery. This chapter can be terrifying, but also exhilarating.
The end of the world, it really is like the ultimate unknown, isn't it? The ultimate test of fate.
It is. And Peterson, he doesn't shy away from the darkness, from the destruction that's depicted in Revelation, but he sees it also as a story of hope, a story of transformation, a story of ultimate renewal.
Okay, so how does he reconcile those two ideas? The end of everything and the possibility of a new beginning.
Well, he argues that the end of days, as depicted in Revelation, it's not just a literal event.
Okay.
It's a metaphor for the constant cycle of death and rebirth, destruction and renewal that we experience both individually and collectively. It's about letting go of the old, embracing the unknown, and stepping into a new way of being.
So it's like he's saying that the apocalypse isn't something to be feared, but embraced. That it's an opportunity for transformation, for a fresh start, for a new beginning.
Precisely. He suggests that this process of apocalypse and renewal is constantly happening, both within us and around us. It's about confronting our shadows, letting go of what no longer serves us, and embracing that possibility of something new, something better.
The powerful idea. Makes you think about all the endings, the beginnings we experience in our own lives, relationships that end, careers that change, Old beliefs falling away, new ones emerging. It's like this constant dance between destruction and creation.
It is, and Peterson seems to be saying that that dance, it's essential for growth, for evolution. It's through those endings, those moments of chaos and uncertainty, that we're forced to confront our deepest fears, our deepest desires, and make choices that will ultimately shape who we become.
That's a lot to take in. But I have to say, this deep dive into We Who Wrestle with God, incredibly insightful. I've got a whole new perspective on these ancient stories and on my own journey of growth and transformation.
Peterson has this incredible ability to bring together psychology, philosophy, spirituality in a way that's thought-provoking, but also deeply personal. He really challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to embrace the complexities of life.
He does. And even if you don't agree with everything he says, he certainly makes you think. And that's the power of a good book, isn't it? It shakes us up, expands our minds, helps us see the world in new ways. I'd highly recommend We Who Wrestle with God to anyone who is ready to really grapple with the big questions, explore those depths of human experience.
It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks. Until next time, keep wrestling, keep seeking, keep growing.